So as we established in the previous video, Resident Evil 7 was initially introduced to the public through a demo known as Beginning Hour. It seemed to take some cues from PT, and also seemed to stray rather far from the last few Resident Evil titles that preceded it, though there was still the question of whether Resident Evil 7 was going to truly end up more like the old school titles that popularized Resident Evil as well as the survival horror genre, or if it would take after more recent horror titles like Amnesia, Slender, or Outlast. It didn't take people long, though, to realize that the game in most ways was classic Resident Evil through and through. The player is given access to a select few large areas to explore non-linearly, solving puzzles, finding keys, and trying to stay alive. Combat did indeed exist in Resident Evil 7 as more than just a passing thing, unlike Beginning Hour, and it was a major part of the experience. But importantly, it was still slow, thoughtful, tense, and asked the player to weigh each shot against the cost and resources. There's an emphasis on atmosphere rather than action. The game prioritizes quiet horror instead of jump scares and gore, and when jump scares and gore do appear, they're all the more impactful due to the sparing use. But first we should probably back up and talk about the story a bit. While the core experience to the story is fulfilling due to the different layers you can focus on, it does have a few issues. Resident Evil 7 initially starts as a story about a man named Ethan, who lost his wife Mia under mysterious circumstances while she was on a trip a few years ago. Eventually, though, he receives a letter from her telling him to come to a house in the middle of nowhere Dulvey, Louisiana. When he makes it there, Ethan quickly realizes that things aren't well here. Mia is locked up in the basement of the guest house, doesn't remember sending the letter at all, and she seems more frightened to see him than relieved. All too quickly, things turn sour when Mia is possessed by something evil and repeatedly tries to kill Ethan. She struggles to maintain control, and though Ethan fights back, Mia seems unstoppable. Eventually, Ethan takes Mia down and tries to escape, but is blindsided by the owner of the residence, Jack Baker. Ethan wakes up at a frighteningly disgusting dinner with most of the Baker family: Lucas the son, Jack the husband, Marguerite the wife, and Grandma. As soon as he gets the chance, Ethan once again tries to escape, and eventually gets a call from the final Baker, Zoe, the daughter. Mia and the whole Baker family has been infected by some sort of parasitic fungus which gives them extremely violent tendencies, regenerative powers, and an obsession with growing their family. Zoe wants no part of it, and has been in hiding for years, but she's also learned how to make a serum which turns a person back to normal if they're not too far gone. Ethan sets out to get the ingredients while trying to survive the other Bakers. Eventually, it's revealed that this problem was caused by a little girl known as Evelyn, who's part of some sort of scientific experiment. She controls the fungus and any of the host bodies. She can spread it far and wide, and is the reason for the violence and obsession inherent in the Bakers and Mia now. After Ethan gets the serum ingredients and takes down Jack for the last time, he's left with just enough for either Mia or Zoe to use. At this point, the player gets to choose between the two, with choosing Mia being the canon ending. Choosing Zoe leads to her quick death right afterward, and then later Ethan needs to kill Mia as well. If you choose Mia, Ethan promises to send help for Zoe. While trying to escape down the bayou, their boat is stopped by Evelyn's fungus, and Mia wakes up on the shore only to find Ethan right before he's taken by the monstrosity. She follows it and eventually runs into Evelyn. Up to this point, Mia doesn't remember how any of this started, but it's revealed to her that she was actually part of a crime syndicate of some sort that was working with Lucas Baker to create bioweapons similar to Evelyn that can infect enemies and turn them against their own forces. Mia was tasked with escorting Evelyn on a cargo ship when Evelyn escaped and destroyed the ship. She also infected Mia, and the two of them were found by Jack Baker a while later. Evelyn quickly infected everyone. With her knowledge restored, Mia focuses on finding Ethan so that they can put an end to Evelyn. But when she does, Evelyn intervenes, forcing Mia back under her control, and Ethan barely escapes. He makes his way through the lab in the mines, creates a substance that's supposed to destroy Evelyn, and heads back to the guest house where he first arrived. Clearly, he too is infected, and it's only a matter of time before he's under her control. Though before that can happen, he confronts the true Evelyn, who has actually been aging rapidly, and is revealed to be Grandma. Ethan injects her, she turns into a giant face that looks just like the one you find in Uncanny Valley, she continues to grow until she engulfs the house, and some soldiers who appeared on the estate right as Ethan was heading into the mines drop you a Samurai Edge pistol that has some serious upgrades. It quickly takes care of the tentacle Evelyn, ending the horrific night. The game closes with the soldiers coming to collect Ethan. One of them reveals himself to be series veteran Chris Redfield, who is now part of Umbrella. Before the player can really process anything, Ethan is taken to the helicopter, where he's delighted to find Mia is still alive and finally free. This story works because it's mostly about the Bakers and their infection. When it starts to turn all science-y and Japanese is when it starts to most closely resemble traditional Resident Evil. While for me this is the least effective bit of the experience, it's also something that feels natural for the series. If you ignore some of the nuances, particularly because they often conflict with how the canon DLC is written, the bigger picture of the story is great, since it's the most grounded and intimate that Resident Evil has been since arguably Resident Evil 2. Still, it does come with some pretty major confusion, especially if you haven't played the DLC. The crime syndicate thing isn't really explained well, and it wasn't until after the game that I really learned it was even a thing. Up to that point, I thought Mia was part of a resurrected Umbrella. To make things more confusing, Umbrella technically was resurrected in 2007 before Resident Evil 5 takes place, but now has a blue logo and works to combat bioterrorism. Chris eventually joins them after leaving the BSAA, which is why he seems to be working with the bad guys, who are now really good. There are also a few other small things I'm still confused about. For example, if Evelyn is actually Grandma and the young Evelyn is just a hallucination seen by people who are infected, whose body is in the small cubby behind the bed after you beat Marguerite? I think this is her shrine to Evelyn that notes talk about, and the arm on the body is part of what you use to create the curative serum. Things like this can bring the story down if you really think about them, and these aren't the only issues either. Things like infection are unclear as well, with documents and events contradicting each other. But again, as a big picture, the story works incredibly well. And in particular, the Bakers are wonderful. They're simultaneously fantastically fun villains, terrifying, and genuinely endearing when you realize they used to be kind, caring people. I enjoyed them so much that honestly, my biggest regret in playing this game is the knowledge that they're likely to never appear again, except for maybe Zoe and Jack's brother Joe. But we'll get to the DLC when we get there. For now, let's jump over to the game itself. Visually, Resident Evil 7 is a real treat. Just like my previous video about Need for Speed 2015, this game goes for a distinct style that uses a lot of post-processing effects to give it a very specific look, and it really works here, often even masking some hilariously low-quality assets that are just sort of hanging out in the open, but the vast majority of the time you're not likely to notice any of this. What's more, the game runs at a solid 60 FPS on PS4 Pro, thanks to the need for the game to run well on the PlayStation VR headset without making people more sick than they already would be. Probably the weakest bit visually comes down to some of the character close-ups, particularly when characters are talking. Sometimes the lip syncing is great, other times it's rather laughable. It never really brought the experience down for me, but it is worth noting because it can be genuinely awful. Sound effects are all crisp, gunshots have great impact, gore sound effects do work, and there's some really great pseudo 3D surround sound going on here, even for people who just use a stereo headset or even television speakers. The music is just as fantastic, and I really grew to love the rural, southern vibe it gives off. It still feels just like classic Resident Evil music in many ways, and focuses more on melody than you find in most other horror games today, but the accenting using things like banjos really sells the aesthetic extraordinarily well, making it stand out. Take a listen. gameplay largely carries on this torch of quality. Enemies in Resident Evil 7 aren't the most varied, though if we're honest, for the most part they aren't varied in the classic survival-oriented games either. For the most part, you'll be facing the molded, people who have been infected with a fungus that gives them extreme regenerative powers and transforms their physical form into something grotesque and dangerous. I personally don't love the basic molded, though they're more than serviceable. The other core types, being the armored molded, the four-legged molded, and the fat molded, all provide different enough types of encounters that the configurations of enemies can create a wealth of challenges. Still, while I appreciate that Resident Evil 7 went for less enemy types with more memorable encounters you can strategize around, it is somewhat undermined at times thanks to the actual mob configurations. The first section of the game entirely consists of Jack Baker in the main house, and then somewhere around 10 basic and armor molded in the basement. It took me around 3.5 hours to go from the intro section to the point where I defeated Jack and moved outside. About 30 minutes of that was me exploring the basement and killing all of these molded. They were more or less all packed into one small stretch of gameplay. Because I didn't get stuck wandering up and downstairs trying to figure out what to do, I literally only ran into Jack once after I got into the main hall area. This means these molded were kind of exhausting and stilted the pacing of this first section of the game a bit. Quick note, if you head toward the bottom section of the basement and find the red dog emblem as early as you can, Jack will actually stop appearing upstairs after he takes the emblem from the shelf. This means you're free to explore everywhere upstairs without issue. One of the last sections of the game, meanwhile, is supposed to be a sort of combat gauntlet, where tons of each type of enemy appear in quick succession to halt your progress. This section of encounters really illustrates why it's good that the game went for a slower pace. The weapon types don't particularly gel with this many enemies. Too many enemies at once can kind of devolve into a mess, and one missed shot can lead to huge repercussions. The classic titles relied on simple auto-aim with the ability to either aim straight up, straight forward, or straight down. This meant that combat was more about strategizing around your clip size, and the timing with which each enemy would reach you. Resident Evil 7 requires actually aiming, so if there are too many enemies, strategy can sometimes just sort of go out of the window. The worst bit is the final section with the two fat molded. On top of the regular difficulty selection, this game uses an adaptive difficulty system similar to the last decade of Resident Evil titles. Enemy damage, health, ammo found, etc. can change to a certain extent depending on how well you're doing. I suppose I must have been doing really well both times I got to this point, because while the fat molded would usually take 2 remote bombs, these two took 4 bombs and 7 bombs, respectively. Fat molded love to do passive damage if you get too close, and have the only long-range attack out of the basic enemies, so it's extremely difficult to get through this encounter in a way that feels smooth, particularly because the environment here seems to be really inconsistent when it comes to blocking the fat molded's vomit attacks for you. Once you get outside after you kill Jack, the game opens up, and you realize that this area is actually much bigger than you might have expected. You'll suddenly be able to explore the dockhouse nearby, as well as a rather large greenhouse. At this point is where you'll start to deal with Marguerite and her insect army. The larger flies are easy enough to deal with using your knife, and the hordes of small flies generally require a bit more persistence. They're best taken out with the flamethrower, and then you should prioritize their nests so that they don't respawn indefinitely. Once again, when combined with the molded and the stalking Marguerite, encounters can be rather intense and dangerous if you're not careful, without turning into Resident Evil 6. Marguerite is, for me, the most unsettling of the group, which I'm sure is a sentiment echoed by many others. Not only do her powers dive much further into the realm of evil and unnatural when compared to Jack's regeneration and super strength, but after your first real fight with her, she'll later show up as a 4-legged mutation of her previous form that has some sort of hive on her lower half, extremely long limbs, and the ability to climb on walls and ceilings. The first time you see her crawling through the little cave was truly unnerving for me. Where Jack feels dangerous, Marguerite is truly horrific. The final boss with her is probably the strongest in the game as well. Jack is a strong encounter on his own, mind you, every time you fight him. His chain scissor weapon can block poorly aimed shots in the normal fight, and he'll start destroying the bodies you can stagger him with and even destroy the center pillar that allows you to avoid damage if you try to cheese the fight. It's clear in design, requires skill and thought to overcome, and feels like a good end to the first section of the game. Marguerite, though, is more of a thinking battle, and can easily overwhelm players who don't pay attention. She'll initially try to grab the player from a window as they head upstairs in the greenhouse. After that, she'll either stalk you on all fours or while standing upright, crawling all over the place and trying to get the jump on you. When she's on all fours, she's really fast, and there's no easy way to reach her weak spot, which is the hive she has growing down there. She also has a lot of health and isn't easily staggered, but the key to her fight is instead listening when she's not chasing you directly. If you start hearing her making gross noises, she's trying to plant a hive on the wall somewhere hidden. At this point, you want to do everything you can to find her and stop her, otherwise you'll have to track down the hive and waste ammo destroying it while she chases you, because not doing so means a constant barrage of both the big and small flies. I cannot stress enough just how good this encounter is both to learn and to master, though it does bring up a good point, which is that I wish the game wasn't so forward with its hints in loading screens. When you die, the game will usually give you a pretty relevant hint related to overcoming the obstacle you just failed. But I think it goes too far, often just straight up telling you the solution. When it's something like explaining the mechanics of a weapon, a smart way to use a piece of equipment, or just reminding you of an ability like the quick turn, it's great. But when it straight up tells you what I just did about searching for and destroying Marguerite's hives during the boss fight, it feels like too much. Maybe relegate that to a player who died multiple times and doesn't seem to be picking up on the concept. After all, figuring out that one strategy makes a world of difference, and is therefore extremely satisfying to find on your own, but can kind of trivialize the battle if you don't find out on your own. After this is probably the most tense part of the game on the first playthrough, but on repeat playthroughs is kind of just a minor time sink. Once you defeat Marguerite, you explore an upstairs part of the building, which is extremely dark, quiet, and builds up the atmosphere with small touches, like the children's toys littered around. It's a stark contrast from everything else up to this point due to how isolated it feels. Every corner feels like the moment for an ambush, and things like the bear, which starts leaking mold from its mouth once you pick it up, add greatly to the tension. Eventually, you make it to the end, find an old body, take its arm because Resident Evil storytelling, and then turn around to find a pair of legs facing you. Whoever they're attached to runs away, forcing you to face the unknown on your way back. This is where the ambush does show up, though it's just more molded. As I said, this section works really well on your first time through, but after you know how it works, you know that you're safe until you reach the end and have to turn around, which is a bit of a shame. The same can be said when entering Lucas's old room from when he was a kid. Inside, you'll find a journal talking about how he locked a fellow kid in the attic for being mean to him. He then says that he can sometimes hear something knocking around up there, and something starts leaking from the ceiling. I was convinced that something was going to be up in the attic, but there's nothing. It's effective tension building, but again, it's a bit of a shame that there's really nothing to it. Randomizing elements like this a bit could provide replayability where there currently is none. Then again, maybe this is changed on Madhouse mode, the hardest difficulty, because a lot of other things certainly are changed. Madhouse mode is something I didn't get the chance to try for this video, but it limits your saves like the old school titles, removes checkpoints, makes the bakers much more dangerous, makes molded act more erratically, changes item placement, and forces the adaptive difficulty system to stay maxed out, similar to Professional on Resident Evil 4. Anyway, after this is the section where you deal with Lucas, which is much more about puzzles and traps due to him being a rather inventive, jigsaw-type psychopath. While interesting in its own right, this section doesn't have too much worth discussing within the scope of this video. Once you've dealt with Lucas's traps and put down the returning blob with too many eyes that Jack has turned into, you head to the place that the story technically started, a crashed ship not too far from the baker's residence. This section makes you play as Mia instead of Ethan, and forces you to temporarily start over in terms of inventory. Half of it is exploring the ship in the past before it had crashed, and then you re-explore the same sections in the present. This sounds repetitive, but it works fairly well thanks to the differences between the environments in each time period. It's basically like two different environments. Eventually, you'll get Ethan back and you'll head down into the mines, which lead back into the guest house. You'll take down the boss, and that will be that. The sections with Lucas and in the mines are both fairly linear, which provides a nice break from the open nature of the Baker house and the ship. In this way, the game is paced pretty similarly to the classic titles, which for me just feels right. One of the best choices I think they made, though, was deciding the game would be played from a first-person perspective. This actually mirrors one of the key advantages of the fixed camera angles from the early games. These camera angles were intentionally designed to limit visibility and hide things from the player. It made the layout of the rooms, items inside, and particularly the threats somewhat of a mystery until you forced yourself to explore. Starting with Resident Evil 4 though, and continuing on even through Resident Evil 2 Remake, the camera is placed behind the character, and in later titles you can even freely move the camera independent of the character. What this means is that you have a lot wider field of view and have options for keeping your character safe while scoping out rooms, like looking around corners. The first-person perspective in Resident Evil 7 prevents this. You can only see the incredibly limited perspective of your character, and if you want them to see around a corner, you have to walk around the corner. If you want them to see enemies they're hiding from, you'll have to peek through cracks and spaces in the environment. If you want to see behind you, you have to turn around. But that obviously also means that what was previously in front of you is now no longer visible. It's behind you. When used correctly, as it is in Resident Evil 7, this is incredibly effective at removing a lot of the player's power, without constantly doing it the cheap way, like by turning all the lights off so you're in pitch black, or not letting the player defend themselves. Resident Evil 7 can use these tropes sparingly because even your base viewpoint, movement speed, etc. do a great job of making your character less omniscient and more vulnerable. Overall, the base game is strong, and is more or less exactly what I was hoping for. It's something I'm sure most fans never thought Capcom could do again, and while it has a few minor issues, particularly with the story, I'm more than happy with what we got. I sincerely hope they follow this game's example for Resident Evil 8. But that's not all there is. Resident Evil 7 also received a large swath of DLC, which all provides a different experience using the same mechanics. So let's go through them each and see what they offer. The first few are part of a collection known as Banned Footage Volume 1. As with the main game, there's an emphasis on viewing events through the medium of VHS tapes. While the banned footage stuff doesn't really adhere to this idea in a realistic manner, like, why would Clancy still have his camera on him when locked in a bed by Marguerite? It still presents these events as if they were recorded in some form. The first of the 3 DLCs in Volume 1 is simply known as Bedroom. As mentioned above, the idea here is that Clancy, from the videotape in the guest house, has been captured, and Marguerite has now locked him up until he chooses to eat the food that infects their victims. This DLC plays out like a room escape puzzle, where you're tasked with finding a multitude of objects, finding where they go, and solving problems that will eventually lead to your escape. The vast majority of the puzzles here are well thought out, and ask the player to think further outside the box than the base game. There's nothing too crazy here, but you're rarely left with just a single item and point of interaction that make it obvious what to do next. Probably the best part of the mode, though, is that certain steps in the process will end up making noise, which attracts the attention of Marguerite. Not only does this mean the player needs to rush back into bed so that it looks like they haven't moved, but Marguerite also has a pretty good sense of what the room was like before she left. So the player also has to remember to rush and put many of the items in their original locations, lest she find out you were out of bed and punish you. 3 hits and you're done for, though she isn't the only way you can get hurt, so care needs to be taken. If there's any weak spot I personally found with this DLC, it would be the knife you need most of the way through. I spent a good 20 minutes and 2 attempts getting stuck at this spot, because the knife is hidden just behind a desk near the door into the storage area. Maybe it's just me, but I really felt the angle you needed to spot the knife was a little too specific. Maybe hiding it under the desk would have been a little better, since it's still essentially the same spot, but not quite as easy to miss. The player is guided to it just a bit more. After Bedroom comes Nightmare. I guess Clancy escaped Marguerite, but was captured again by Jack and thrown in the basement. Or maybe not. I don't know if these DLCs are canon, and I didn't pay that close of attention to the dates at the beginning to see which comes first. Anyway, Nightmare is an intense horde mode of sorts, where you're tasked with surviving a handful of rounds, represented by hours of the night. You have a decent chunk of the basement to explore, waves of enemies that show up including 2 boss fights with Jack, a bunch of traps to exploit, items, weapons, and upgrades to buy, and scrap machines that fund said traps and purchases. This mode to some people is probably the closest thing to Mercenaries that you'll find in Resident Evil 7, but there's a distinctly different focus here. Not only is there a more nuanced progression system than the usual unlocking of characters and levels for doing well, but there isn't really a focus on the score, where Mercenaries is really all about getting combos and points. Nightmare is fun for a while, and there's a harder version if you beat it, known as Night Terror. It's certainly a mode that's possible to beat on your first go, but it becomes easier the more you fail, since it allows you to unlock new options in the store and bonuses as you collect score. Score here effectively works like experience points. I'm of 2 minds about this system, because on the one hand it does make it so that everyone should be able to beat the mode eventually, if they just keep at it. But on the other hand, it feels a little like the game doesn't want you to win in your early attempts, but then kind of hands it to you on your later ones. Still, I found that if you focus on scrap collection as your priority and take a few risks in early waves, it's not impossible to beat from the very start. The real challenge, though, is found in the final part of Banned Footage Volume 1, known as Ethan Must Die. This mode asks the player to take a set path from the yard, through the house, and back out to the greenhouse to fight Marguerite. But there's a catch. Enemies are ruthlessly powerful. There are traps everywhere, ammo is more scarce than you could possibly imagine. Oh, and you start with nothing and have to scavenge for random items in semi-randomly generated containers. Containers can have different rarities, and it's not uncommon for them to be fake, which will end you if you're foolish enough to open it anyway. This mode initially seems like a joke, and it took me probably 15 tries just to get through the main hall of the house, the first section that has enemies. The good thing is that they prepared for this, so loading is lightning fast for retries, and if you can make it back to where you died, you can break a statue that appears which gives you back a random item you had in your inventory. Still, due to the intense difficulty, I decided to look up a guide to see how it was supposed to be done, and after getting a few tips, I started making my way further through. My best attempt saw me getting about 3/4 of the way done before failing, though I was woefully unprepared for the fight with Marguerite, so I likely would have lost anyway. I don't mind the roguelike adjacent elements here at all, but it really feels like there's a certain set of drops the game expects you to have to win. It's entirely possible and even likely that you will get to the end and just not have enough to win without somehow defeating Marguerite with your knife. Not an easy task, considering it's not uncommon for the player to die in one hit in this mode. I still think the mode is worth trying after you look up how it's done, but I'd be lying if I said that I didn't think it was a bit too cheap. A good chunk of the ways you'll die if you go in blind are through traps that are designed as beginner's traps. Some of these can be consistently used against enemies, but a lot of them are just ammo wasters once you know what you're doing. And many others will either blindside you if you don't know what you're doing, or even kind of have a high chance of blindsiding you if you do know what you're doing. I think offering an easier alternative difficulty that made enemies take less damage but randomized more of the traps would have given the mode more life. but as it is, it's primarily more like a puzzle to be memorized, which you then have to find the right metaphorical keys to complete using luck. After this came Banned Footage Volume 2, which offered 3 more small DLCs to explore. The first is one that I initially expected to be pretty bland, but turned out to be one of my favorites, known simply as 21. It's Lucas's second turn to torture Clancy, who he's locked up to various contraptions and is now forcing him to play blackjack to win back his life. I'm going to assume you know how to play blackjack. The initial mode serves as the story segment for the DLC, where Clancy is playing another person who has the same objective. The dialogue and events are interesting, and there's a puzzling little twist at the end if you've been paying close attention to the mechanics. It also serves as a rather strong tutorial to prepare you for exactly how the rest of the mode is played. After you've gone through this part, you unlock Survival Mode, which is a series of opponents that you'll have to beat in a row. Your punishments are persistent between opponents, so you'll have to work hard to make sure you don't meet your limits before the end. After this, you unlock Survival Plus, which ratchets up the 5 opponents to 15, and now has the player switching between the various game modes introduced in the tutorial. The first one gives you 5 fingers to bet. Lose a bet and you lose whatever fingers have been bet. Lose all 5 and you lose the game. The second mode has Clancy attached to a machine that shocks the loser. Whatever bet you have is how hard the shock will be. A shock level of 10 will kill you, nothing else will. The key is that once you lose a bet, the shock level doesn't decrease, it will only go up from there. The final mode has a saw blade of doom in between 2 players, and works almost like tug of war. There are 7 levels between each player and the neutral position. Lose and whatever the bet was is how many levels closer the saw will get to you, but if you win, it will move that many levels in the opposite direction, meaning you're never out until you're out. So far, the mode doesn't sound particularly interesting, and honestly, I was expecting to try survival for like 10 minutes and then move on. I ultimately ended up making it all the way through survival and most of the way through survival plus before I lost. In fact, I didn't even lose a single finger when playing through the 5 rounds of survival. There are 2 key differences between this and normal blackjack, and these are pretty major differences. Firstly, the deck of cards you play with isn't a standard deck. In total, there are only 11 cards that can be drawn, numbering 1 through 11. There's no ace that can serve as either a 1 or an 11, and there are no suits, meaning each number will only appear once. As such, the core game becomes one of counting what cards are in play, trying to figure out the face-down card your opponent has so that you know their hand, and deciding the risks associated with drawing another card based on what's still in the deck. In a sense, it's a really simplified version of counting cards. The second difference is that as you play, you can earn a hand of what are called trump cards to use as you see fit. Trump cards work similar to trainer cards in the Pokemon TCG, each having a unique effect when played. These cards can do a multitude of things, from adding a point to your opponent's bet, to taking points away from your bet, to drawing a specific number from the deck, to raising the target score from 21 to 24 or even 27, to automatically drawing the best card for your hand from those that remain in the deck, and more. The reason this mode can be so addicting is because you'll quickly realize once you start survival mode that it's much more about trump card usage than just regular blackjack. There are a lot of creative plays you can use to your advantage, though as you might have noticed at the end of the story portion of the DLC, the opponents can be pretty creative with their trump cards as well. In fact, each opponent has a specific set of AI and certain trump cards that they'll play, which turn them into a sort of turn-based boss encounter whose pattern you need to learn to overcome. The moment I realized this mode was for me was the moment I used a trump card to draw a specific number from the deck, not because I wanted that number, but because I wanted to see if that was the number my opponent had lying face down. When I didn't get the number I'd requested, I knew he had it and could figure out his hand. Counting the cards, using trump cards for unorthodox strategies, and trying to figure out the different weaknesses of each opponent was insanely fun for me, and this is honestly a game I could play outside of Resident Evil 7 and enjoy completely. My turns could sometimes take minutes of strategizing like you would in chess, planning out exactly what trump cards to use in what order, to try to get myself into the most advantageous position possible. If there's one weakness, it's that not all of the AI opponents are super fun to play against. In particular, there's one that loves to use shield cards to block your bets against him, which kind of just drags the match out. But still, this is undeniably one of the most creative DLCs for RE7. After 21 comes Sisters, a short story-driven puzzle of sorts with multiple endings, which sees the player taking control of Zoe Baker on the night that Evelyn destroys her family. There's not too much to say here since a lot of it's fairly standard. It's mostly about finding the specific order to accomplish the right tasks to get the best ending. It's short and there's not any traditional combat. And while it contradicts some stuff shown in the main story, I still think the direction and pacing of the DLC is effective, particularly the section where Marguerite and Jack turn. The final banned footage DLC is Jack's 55th birthday, which is definitely the best combat-focused minigame you can choose. It's ridiculous, hilarious, challenging without being insanely punishing, and affords the player a lot of meaningful choice to really push themselves. The game goes like this. It's Jack's 55th birthday, and Mia is tasked with getting him his birthday dinner. Ingredients are strewn across the various available levels, which can either be taken straight to Jack to fill him up a little, or can often be combined into something much more effective. Fill him up in the time allotted, and the faster you do it, the better your score. Killing enemies will pause the clock temporarily. Destroying the hidden Mr. Everywhere statues will double the current amount of paused time you have stocked up, and the player has a wealth of options for the loadouts they can use. Similar to Nightmare, the better score you get, the more options you unlock. Certain enemies must be defeated to unlock certain doors in other areas or rooms, and enemies will generally respawn a few times as you retread a location. To me, this is a bit more like your usual Mercenaries mode, and is ultimately more rewarding than Nightmare mode for me. Not only does it offer several more environments to play in, but there are remixes of each environment as well. I also found the fact that doing well unlocked rewards much more palatable than simply racking up score over time like experience. Doing well in Nightmare may or may not unlock anything depending on what your next goal is. Getting a higher grade score on a level in Jack's 55th birthday will always unlock something. If there's any banned footage that I think is the most rewarding for people who want something replayable that's somewhat close to the basic gameplay loop of the base game, this would be it. The final two DLCs are completely story-related and play out more like straight-up variations on the base game. Not a Hero is a free DLC that stars Chris Redfield and takes place right after the game ends. Chris needs to hunt down Lucas, who Ethan never took down, and there's reason to believe he's in the mines. Along the way, you'll find out that Lucas was working with the crime syndicate the whole time and is responsible for what happened to his family. This DLC is much more combat-focused and shows how well RE7's mechanics can translate to a straight-up first-person shooter with just a few tweaks. Where the base game doesn't feel like that would work terribly well, this does thanks to the change in weapons and defense. Chris is pretty strong, and his weaponry is assault weaponry, so it's a lot more powerful. He also gains access to a few gadgets and tactical equipment. Not a Hero places you in a main chamber of the mines, which branches off in a few directions. As you explore, you'll gain access to a couple different tools for progression, like ammo that renders some new enemy types vulnerable where they otherwise wouldn't be, a gas mask to prevent infection, an upgrade to that gas mask, and even night vision capabilities. Exploration kind of works like a really small Metroidvania title, where the player goes down one path until they find an upgrade and hit a wall, and then they head down another path and repeat until eventually everything is mapped out and they can make their way to Lucas. Similar to Sisters, there's not a whole lot more to say about this mode. Not because it's super simple or because it's not well made, it's meaty, rewarding, and is nicely designed. but it's also mostly just more Resident Evil 7 beyond what I've described above, which means you know what to expect. In some ways, the same can be said for the final DLC, End of Zoe. This is also supposed to be a canon DLC, which takes place after Not a Hero. Jack Baker's brother, Joe Baker, lives in a nasty old shack nearby on the bayou. Joe comes across some Umbrella soldiers in the forest right after they've finally secured Zoe, who's still being haunted by Evelyn's influence. Mistaking these soldiers for old school Umbrella, Joe takes them down with his fists and then interrogates one of them to find out what they supposedly did to Zoe and how to fix it. Along the way, Joe learns what really happened, realizes that he's being stalked by Jack, who somehow still hasn't been completely dealt with, and works to save Zoe from what ails her. Once again, this is a DLC that primarily plays like the base game and Not a Hero, though instead of relying on guns, Joe uses thrown together tools like spears, or throwing knives in the unlockable hard mode entitled Joe Must Die. He also eats bugs to heal, and he uses his fist fighting skills to take down his enemies. Your primary mode of combat here will be combos of punches, some of which have special effects. While this doesn't change the game a whole lot, it's still more than a welcome change. Similar to Not a Hero, this DLC lasts a couple of hours, and primarily takes place in new versions of old locations. Also similar to Not a Hero, there's not much to say here. The DLC is punctuated by fist fights with Swamp Thing Jack, and culminates in the final curtain on the story of Resident Evil 7, where Zoe is finally saved from her curse, and it's revealed that Ethan is responsible for sending the Umbrella soldiers to try and find her, as he promised her in the base game. This DLC is fun, particularly thanks to the new enemy types like Jack, the molded gators, and the new environments. Again, it doesn't change too much, but it's also just enough that it's still a great joy to play through. Overall, the DLC is strong, though I do think it could have been much stronger. What works here really works, but some other things like Ethan Must Die struggle a bit. Though with such variety and such risks taken, I'd say this is easily better than the optional content as a whole you get in most other games in the series. I think the best thing about the DLC is honestly how varied it is. I may not think modes like Ethan Must Die are particularly well designed, but so much of it shows you how well the game's core mechanics can be used to create vastly different experiences. They really got a ton out of Resident Evil 7 here, and I'm extremely hopeful that they'll use this as the blueprint for RE8 when the time comes. Overall, I'm blown away at how well RE7 succeeded in not only bringing back the classic survival horror experience we've been missing from the genre for so long, but more importantly, in just making a fantastically tense, scary, and well-polished game on its own. This is very nearly about as good as I could have hoped for, and far more than I ever expected. Even almost 3 years out, it largely holds up and will likely be considered a classic in due time. I haven't yet played through the Resident Evil 1 or 2 remakes, but putting them aside, I can easily say this is probably the best game in the series. But what do you guys think? Have you played Resident Evil 7? How do you think it compares to the other games in the series? What about contemporaries from other horror franchises? What would you like to see from RE8 if they do decide to carry on from 7 instead of the RE2 remake? Sound off in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.
Hey, put that door back! Put that door back up! Wait!